The first question that was submitted, it says, what does diversity actually look like to you? What does racism look like? I find that these are two questions that no one ever asks. When in London in 2007, students asked to touch my locks, and I was told that I didn't act like a Black American. I was told that I was being sensitive when I spoke to the issue with both of these actions. No one saw the problem because they saw both of those things as compliments. Until we are on the same page in the beginning, we can't move forward together. Aliza, would you like to respond first?
Absolutely. I find this instance disturbing, and I think there's a name for this. It's something that some of us might be familiar with as a term, which is the idea of a microaggression. Microaggressions are kinds of violences that don't necessarily appear as such to all parties involved. So here, that idea that a kind of inherently racist moment of objectification and alienation might seem like a compliment is a perfect instance of how that manifests. Microaggressions, I would say, are a significant component of thinking about racism because, again, it's part of this everyday habit of domination. It's another way that we could think about racism, and specifically white supremacy, as not being something that's easy to identify in overt acts of violence, which, I'd say most people feel horrified about, but actually is something that we have to be very vigilant, especially as white people, in thinking about as encoded in certain kinds of everyday behaviors. So I think it's important to define racism as including both overt eruptions of violence, as well as these everyday practices of microaggression. And I think also it's worth pointing out that a lot of these microaggressions are themselves encoded in language. Something I noticed when I saw this question from when it was written out is this sort of difference in language between referring to hair as locks versus referring to hair as dreads or dreadlocks. Dreadlocks, of course, is a term that comes from this history of colonialism, specifically this British colonial gaze upon the Black body in this context of colonial encounter. So even sort of ideas like that, we can see encoded in kind of everyday descriptions. And I think one of the ways that we might think about being vigilant about racism, being vigilant about our own role in white supremacy and the ways in which we might reproduce that is to be attentive to not only our social interactions, but also the language that we use. And I'll just say, often this is called being politically correct. And I just want to address that term. And for any of my SIA students who are listening to this, forgive me because I know you've heard me say this a couple times. Political correctness is, I think, a kind of misnomer. Nobody wants to be policed. Nobody wants to feel like they're saying something or doing something, or because it is correct, especially if that thing might feel uncomfortable or if it might make them feel like they're being critiqued. So I think it's really important that instead of thinking about political correctness and debating political correctness, we actually call this what it is, which is nonviolent speech. How can we use language in a way that is nonviolent to others? What does it cost us to shift that language? And if that cost is small and its impact is large, I think we have an ethical imperative to take that upon ourselves. So here, it's a long answer, but it's just to say, I think this question really points out an important idea, which is that racism is not necessarily something that is an overt spectacle. It's something that's encoded in everyday practice, and especially the words that we use.
Claude, what's your response to this description of racism of a very personal nature from your practical and personal point of view?
Hey, Errol, I'm going to start with hair because actually that's one thing that Black people always talk about, and I'm glad the question had related to locks. And I'm going to start with my own hair and growing up in Paris and just having to deal with questions that a teenager would face, and a Black teenager would be asked, that Black teenager being me would be asked, can I touch your carpet? And then I would wonder, what kind of carpet do you mean? Oh, that carpet on your head. And so all of a sudden I'd have my white friends, teenage friends, to say, oh, I want to touch this carpet. And that just became another episode of what the French people now call ordinary racism. And so everyday racism, ordinary racism, whatever we call it, ended up being the reason I decided to become a media entrepreneur, having worked as a journalist and also as an editor, just strictly just focused on these race issues. And so by the time I moved to London and became a student in London, the racism that I encountered there was quite different. Because, you know, obviously London being a major metropolis in that way with huge diversity, it was a lot more covert because of just the British nature of things being a little bit more covert. And so as a reaction to the fact that Brits, like the French, did not ever want to talk about racism because quote unquote racism didn't exist. And this term ordinary racism is actually quite new in France. You know, the French Republic, when I was growing up, and it's still the case now, is supposed to be indivisible. So that's why you could never have any affirmative action. You could never have any census that pretty much distinguishes citizens between different races and so on. And so as a reaction to this lack of recognition for an issue that I considered to be central to my own identity, I ended up creating a magazine called Trace that specifically tackled these issues. And the way that I was able to make Trace successful as a media venture was by being head-on confrontational about you know, a lot of these issues. And the reason I don't want to talk in theory and more based on lived experience is because when I published the first Black Girls Rule issue of Trace in 1997, I had to deal with so much criticism because I put Black Girls Rule on the cover of my magazine. And then all of a sudden I had to answer questions related to, what do you mean Black Girls Rule? Don't white girls rule? Don't Asian girls rule? And I was coming from the perspective of a hip hop fiend, which is what I was at the time. And I was emboldened by the attitude of a lot of these rappers that I was very much enamored with because of the way they were really using music and youth culture to question a lot of the established orders that we had to deal with in society. And because a lot of that energy was coming from New York, I decided to move from London to New York. And then what happened in New York is really interesting because all of a sudden, being in the center of the media world, which is in some ways is also the center of the music world and the fashion world and the art world, I ended up meeting a lot of different people who shared my point of view. And in New York, I really blossomed through shared affinities because I met people who felt that they had to question the status quo. And that gave me a lot of confidence to be able to really feature very radical thinkers and workers and practitioners in my media ventures and promote them in a way that now feels almost timid versus what I'm seeing the new generation of activists doing. And so in my journey of being an editor, publisher, writer, a cultural critic, and now educator, what I find is that I have to look back and respond to some of my own mistakes that I made when I was trying to climb up the ladder in the media world in New York City. And the way that I was co-opted by certain corporations, large corporations, Goldman Sachs, which funded me, Nissan, Hilton Hotels, Target Corporation, these very large multinationals that really wanted my take and my team's take on this racial issue. I feel like the mistake that we made as a group is being a little bit too polite about what some of the remedies might be to this issue. And the reason I'm so inspired by this new generation of Black Lives Matter activists is because they have a lot less to lose and their tactics and their strategies are a lot more radical than the ones that I employed when I started being co-opted by these corporations and institutions and even elements of the US government. They are really clear about the fact that they need justice and they need justice now. Whereas in my perspective, there was no way I could be the angry Black man because that angry Black man stance would get me kicked out of the room, and it was important to have a seat at the table versus being kicked out of the room. And so I felt that what I was doing was quite radical at the time, but compared to what I'm seeing now, again, our tactics are a lot more timid than this kind of very bold demand action now type of stance that is pretty much the movement that is that we're seeing on every street corner in America, and also in the UK, and also in France, and a lot of other places that I've traveled to lately.